Good morning, and seize the day. Another time to give us an opportunity to come together and just open the Word and begin our day. Uh, just considering again some of the teachings and stories concerning Jesus. We've been in a series called Now What, and the series is all about the response that people are giving to Jesus, and now that he has begun to fully disclose his true identity as the Son of God. Jesus has demonstrated himself as one who is uh, uh, the son of God by virtue of his birth. He's the son of Abraham, son of David. We've seen that through the first four chapters in the book of Matthew that just underscore for us all of the details surrounding the birth of Jesus. We've seen it in his teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. We've seen it through his miracles now in chapters 8 and 9. And so we've been walking our way through this next series of chapters that are just beginning to underscore again the responses that people are giving to Jesus. For instance, this past couple of weeks, right, we've looked at a passage in 11 where John was a little confused and Jesus had to set the record straight for John. And then we saw how Jesus confronted some of the cities that many of his miracles had been performed in, and Jesus holds them account, saying that they should have repented. They should have seen in his work. They should have listened closely to his message as he came to proclaim this good news of the kingdom of heaven. That that it would have given pause for them to reflect upon their lives and also upon all that God is doing in and through his ministry. But they did not, right? They kept them at many within the crowds. They kept them at arm's distance, as well as the Pharisees. And so Jesus, is saying, listen, if the miracles that have been performed in you had been done and then he made references to many of the Old Testament cities like Tyre and Sidon, Sodom, places that when you read through the scriptures, you realize that God came down pretty heavy. We saw that as we began to look in a number of passages, for instance, in Isaiah, where God was saying, look, I'm going to bring judgment upon the cities of Tyre and Tyre. These were Phoenician cities, wealthy cities, and they were Gentile cities. So it wasn't just the Jews that God was going to bring judgment upon. It was beginning to an unfolding of God's displeasure on the world as it stood, and there's all kinds of history that bears that up. So this text today is found for us in Matthew chapter 12, and in Matthew chapter 12, what we're going to begin to take a look at together, right, is another response. Only this time we're going to take a look at how people are responding to Jesus's authority, and how Jesus really defends that authority, right? How he begins to assert that authority in the midst of all of this opposition. And I think that's a good lesson for us to begin to just think about, because sometimes if people push back against you, we have a tendency of wanting to really strongly push back, right? I mean, like you hurt me, I want to hurt you. And the gospel of Jesus is saying that the only way we're going to overcome evil is not by replicating the evil, but by doing good. And Jesus is beginning to demonstrate what this really means. And so what I'd like for you to do is look at this passage with me here in Matthew chapter 12, and I'd like to read it for you this morning, and then we're going to take a look at it together and just draw some lessons and then begin to think about how Jesus' authority is being challenged, okay? Well, Matthew 12 begins this way. It says, at that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. So Jesus had just finished speaking, pronouncing these woes, as we referred to them last week. And previous to this passage, I want to remind you again of these words that were really being used to draw people a little bit closer to himself. One of the things that we find here, Jesus says, right before this chapter 12, at the end of chapter 11, he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." When you look at that text in Matthew 11, it's a famous text. Many of you have probably already heard that. It's a great invitational text to saying, "Come to me." And he recognizes that in this world, we're going to find ourselves in positions where we are weary and burdened. And he says, and I'm going to give you rest. He says, the rest that I give, he says, comes as a result of people putting on this yoke, working with me, because together we're going to shoulder the load that people are experiencing in this life. There's a reason why he speaks to them as weary and burdened, because there is a weariness that comes with this world. You know, I've been watching a show. It's called Alone, and it's all about a number of people who have been dropped off in this remote place in British Columbia. It's right at the change of seasons. They were allowed to bring just X number of tools, really, like cord or knapsacks and things like that, a tarp, but no food, and they would not be able to contact anyone from the outside. They had cameras with them that they were evidently, as you watch the show, they were being asked to record themselves every day and just speak about what's going on for them on that particular day. So here they are, completely isolated from the rest of the world, no real conveniences. They have to forage for their food. They have to deal with, in this area where they are, grizzly bears were very populated, other animals of prey. They had to hunt for their food, make shelters, and all of this is as the seasons are beginning to change, because part of this is going to spill over as the more time that they spend, the more time that the weather's going to change. It gets colder. It begins to snow, and the whole contest is see who can stay the longest. Because if whoever outlasts the others will gain a prize of about $500,000. So they're all pretty excited when they get there, and now it's they've been in there now over a month, and it's been hard going. And you could just see that the land, while the scenery is beautiful, there's beautiful lake and snow-capped mountains, eagles are flying, all of the people who have been trained, and these individuals have to hunt and live out in the outdoors. Boy, it becomes pretty harsh, and you realize, oh my gosh, there's so many modern conveniences that make this life a little easier. But if you go back and you're really having to, just find your way. Nothing is coming easy for these people. Not even finding food, not even fishing, and it's becoming quite the chore. It's amazing to see how ingenious they are, but at the same time, you realize, boy, there is an added weariness and burden just living this life. And I remember thinking about this passage then in Matthew 12, because Jesus here is talking about rest, right? He's saying, if you come to me, those of you who are weary, burdened, He says, I will give you rest. Think about that. So the whole invitation that Jesus is bringing is so that our lives would be enhanced. That he says here, if you learn from me, in other words, if I am allowing Jesus to speak into my life, recognizing that this teaching, he says, it's like putting on a yoke that is going to make it's easier. It's going to make this burden lighter. It's not meant to make life harder. It's meant to give us an aid in dealing with the constant challenges that life brings. So Jesus is saying, if you come to me, I'm going to give you rest for your soul. And so following that idea of rest, we're told two stories where Jesus is going to do things on the Sabbath day. So the Sabbath becomes this context for the next couple of sayings that Jesus has. And if you know anything about the Sabbath, then you begin to realize that the Sabbath, well, it was a place that God says, I want to give you rest. And so I thought we'd spend a few moments this morning just talking a little bit about this Sabbath rest and what it was all about, because in the context of chapter 12, this Sabbath, Jesus is going to just use that to further indicate this rest that he is offering. And so this idea of rest, and then starting to speak about what activity is happening on the Sabbath, it's not an accident in this book of Matthew. And the two of those things are going to come closer and closer together. So I'm going to read through these 14 verses for you, and then just make some comments on this whole idea of Sabbath rest. So here's the scene. Disciples are going out, they're picking grain, they're snacking as they go, they're probably hungry, and as they're traveling with Jesus, they have physical needs that need to be met, right? And so they're picking up this grain, and it happens to be on the Sabbath day. So the Pharisees saw this behavior, and they say to the disciples, what they are doing is unlawful on the Sabbath day. So if you're a note taker, just underscore that word there, unlawful, and we're going to get back to it, all right? But notice how Jesus answered. Jesus says, haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Because the consecrated bread was part of the services, right? The worship time, and David and his companions, they weren't priests, but there is a time in our Old Testament, and we'll take a look at that, when David went into the house of God and ate this consecrated bread. And he gives him another instance too. He says, haven't you read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple desecrate the day and yet are innocent? What does he mean by that? That the priests desecrate the day and yet are innocent. Well, the priests are working on the Sabbath, are they not? The priests are the ones who are gathering in, the offerings that people are bringing. They are conducting the services that are required every day by the law of God. The priests were set apart for this task, but God's word, right, the Ten Commandments said to observe the Sabbath and keep it holy. On that day, it says, no man is to do any work. Well, the priests are working. It made me smile because I think, hey, that's kind of like my job. I'm working on Sundays. And so here Jesus is reminding the Pharisees who are saying, hey, this is an unlawful thing to do. He's already given them two instances where it seems that people weren't really, these were some exceptions here that were being found to the way in which this law was being, lived out. And then Jesus says it plainly. He says, I tell you, he says, I tell you, or here it goes, I tell you that one greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. And the innocent in this passage are those those disciples of Jesus who are walking through and eating part of these grain fields. So he says, if you would have known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So now, do you realize what's just being said? Jesus is putting himself on the same par as God. He's saying that the one who gave the command to observe the Sabbath, Jesus is saying, I'm Lord of the Sabbath. He puts himself on an equal footing with God in this text. And then he goes on from this place, and this is verse 9 of Matthew 12. He says, going on from that place, he went to the synagogues, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Now, this is very important. It says, looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Because, see, the Pharisees, they've already come to a conclusion on what is considered to be work on the Sabbath. And as a result of their definition of what work is, they made it very clear by their long and tedious lists of what it meant to keep the Sabbath day. So they're asking Jesus a question really just to set him up, because this is all about a challenge to Jesus' authority. See, just like when in verse 2, they come after Jesus and say, hey, you know, what your disciples are doing is unlawful on the Sabbath. See, they're coming from a position of authority, right? They're going to tell Jesus what is right and what is not right. And yet Jesus turns around and tells them, you're mistaken, because I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, right? I'm the one who was behind this whole giving of this law. I was with the Father when all of this was being mandated. So Jesus then, now, when they want to know, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath, he understands that really what's going on here is that they're looking for a way to trap him. But notice how Jesus responds. In verse 11 he says, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a man than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Did Jesus not just say, he says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice? In other words, isn't it the most merciful thing if it's in your power to do good in that moment, rather than just heeding to your particular sacrifices that you might be making on the day? Let me give you another example of this. Well, let me read this first. It says, verse 13 then goes on and says, then Jesus said to the man, stretch out your hand. So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. Isn't that interesting? We went in verse 2, where they're confronting Jesus from a position that they are in authority, and they're trying to place Jesus as doing things that are unlawful. Then you get to 9, and now they're looking for reasons to out and out accuse Jesus before the people, right? And so what they really are trying to do is that they're trying to place Jesus in a defenseless position. They're trying to cast all kinds of aspersions on him, so that those who are beginning to follow him and look after him, he would be discredited. And now you get to verse 14, and it says they're out now trying to kill Jesus. But think about what he has done. He just healed a man whose hand was shriveled, and now he made him whole. How do you think that guy felt about that miracle? It was a game changer for him. And everybody else that saw it should have been rejoicing at this fact. And what are they doing? They're now making plans to kill Jesus. Why? Because Jesus didn't fit into their mold. He wasn't doing things the way they wanted him to do. And Jesus is telling them that they had their minds so much on their own man-made rules and regulations that they've forgotten God's ultimate command here was to do mercy, to love justice, and to walk humbly with your God. That's what God is requiring of us. And they seem to forget that. And in its place, they have begun to put a burden on people that was way, way too heavy for them to bear. Now do you understand a little bit more about what Jesus is saying when he says, I've come to give you rest? This is a rest that is meant to help them to relieve burdens, not add burdens on. And so one of the stories that comes to mind here in this idea of how we can make up our own rules, or we have our own designated behaviors that we want to make sure that we're doing, even if it means that we're violating everything that God is calling us to do. Remember the story of the Good Samaritan. In the story of the Good Samaritan, it says a man, this Samaritan, who was, by the way, hated, and estranged from the Jewish community. He goes and he's on this road, and he gets overcome by thieves, and they rob him of all of his goods and leave him half beaten and dead, leave him for dead on this road, and they take off. And then, if you remember the story, and Jesus is telling this story because he had a gentleman come and ask him, he says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, well, what does the law say? And the man says, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus says, do these things and you will live. And then the man turns around and says, well, who is my neighbor? And so he wants to trap Jesus into this question. And Jesus says, well, you want to talk about who your neighbor is? Then he tells him the story of the Good Samaritan. And as he's telling him the story, the Good Samaritan now is left for dead on this road, robbed. And then he says, there was a priest that came by. He was on his way to the temple. He has a job to do, right? But he comes and he sees this man on the ground, and he steps over him and he keeps on going. Why do you think he did that? Or the next one, he says, a Levite came, one who was responsible for, all of the administration that took place within the temple, getting things ready, making sure supplies were given for the priests to conduct their services. The Levites were the hands-on people that were part of this whole worship, kind of environment. Well, it says they crossed over and they kept walking too. And then who comes by but a Samaritan? And he sees the man, and he tends to the man and picks him up and brings him to a place and offers to pay for this guy while he is getting well. And he said on his return trip, whatever extra may be needed, he'll make sure to settle the accounts then. And then Jesus looked to this wise ruler, right, and says, okay, who was a good neighbor to that man? And the guy says, the one who showed him mercy. And you see, the guy wants to know, who is my neighbor? Jesus wants to know, are you being a good neighbor? Does that story illustrate a little bit about what's going on here with the Pharisees, thinking in terms of their rules, their regulations, how things need to work out here, and then holding Jesus accountable to their interpretations, when it's really not something that has been described in the scriptures in that way? That's why when you go back and you think about what this Sabbath was really supposed to be all about, you begin to realize, but that this is really totally something different. He says, there's a text that's found here. I'll put it up on a screen for you. There is this text that we read in the book of Deuteronomy, and chapter 5, and you'll see that in this book of Deuteronomy, it is it's a recap. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, there's a recap here of the Ten Commandments, and I'd like to read this passage for you. This is Moses delivering what these Ten Commandments are again to all of Israel as they are on the verge of inheriting this new promised land. And he says to them, here are the commandments, right? I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make an idol in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. He goes on, he says, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. And then he adds, observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, your daughter, your manservant, your maidservant, your ox, your donkey, any of your animals, not even the alien within your gates, so that your manservant, maidservant may rest as you do. And so this whole idea of the Sabbath day is for them to find rest. And you notice how this Sabbath day, it just doesn't only affect the Israelites, and it doesn't even affect those who are outside of the camp of Israel, right? The reference there to the foreigner that may be living with them. It applies to the animals. And in other texts, we're going to find that God is going to give a Sabbath rest even to the land every 7th year, right? So this idea of rest, don't you see that was something that was always in the mind of God? That the Ten Commandments, right, are given after the fall. So the world is already a broken place. The Israelites are already experiencing, and have experienced for quite some time, right, the burden and the weariness that is in this life. Just think, prior to this event of them getting the Ten Commandments, God had to intervene and deliver them from the hands of the Egyptians, who had them enslaved for over 400 years. God comes in and does this mighty work and brings and sets these people free. And then now they're getting ready to embark. He says, I want you to live life differently from the cultures that are around you. These commandments that I give you, they're going to set you apart. They're going to demonstrate to the world around that you belong to me. Doesn't that sound like this yoke that Jesus is also trying to give us? He's saying it's not supposed to be a burden. Don't turn it into something that is robbing you of rest. It's supposed to be enhancing rest. So he says here, observe this day, 1 day out of the week. 6 days you labor, 7th day, everybody rests. It's a time to realign yourself, to reflect upon your relationship not only with God, but with your fellow humanity, and physically and emotionally, spiritually, to find this rest. And now what the Pharisees have done is they've begun to make up all kinds of rules of what it means not to work on the Sabbath. And so when Jesus says the healing of a man, he says, it's not work. He says, that's showing compassion and mercy. Of course you should do those kinds of things. But for the Pharisees, they think that that's work. going through the grain fields and eating some grain, first of all, they had prescriptions on how far you should be able to walk from your home before it was considered work. That you weren't allowed to fix your own meals, right? You couldn't even light a candle. That was considered work. You would have other people do that for you, which then violates again the idea that I thought even the maidservant and the manservant were supposed to be resting. So it's not just that you would rest, but everybody would rest. It was a sign that before God, man, we're all equal. We're all in the same space. And yet they turned it into something totally different. And when Jesus doesn't fit into their mold, what do they want to do? They want to kill him. So not only are they looking for reasons to accuse Jesus, now we find at the end of this text, the very one who says, I want to give you rest, is the very one that now they're saying, yeah, we're going to plot to remove him. So it's interesting to see how Jesus is responding. He's not capitulating to them. In fact, he's constantly just uncovering, which you could see how that could get under the skin of the Pharisees who had an idea that they were all that. Well, we're going to continue with this story throughout this week as we see how Jesus, stands up to their assaults against his own authority. And we'll learn a bunch of things that might help us as we continue to live our life out before him. So I trust that today you leave our time together a little bit more refreshed, ready to seize the day, and remembering that God is good all the time. Thank you so much for being a part of Seize the Day. Lord willing, we'll spend some more time again tomorrow. Looking forward to that. And just continue to read chapter 12. It's a very, very interesting chapter as we continue to look at the life of Jesus. God bless you.